Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My friends and I had rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere. A remote, wooded area with no cell service and nothing but the sound of rustling leaves to break the silence. We were far from civilization, and it was exactly what we wanted. The cabin itself was small, old, and charming in a rustic way. The wooden walls creaked with age, and the flickering gas lamps gave the place a warm glow. After setting up our things, we gathered in the living room, the fire crackling softly as we exchanged stories. But as night fell, something felt off. The cabin had a strange vibe to it, like it had secrets. The air was thicker, quieter. The sound of the wind seemed to carry more weight than usual, brushing against the windows as though it was trying to get in. That's when we found it. A basement door hidden beneath a rug in the corner of the living room. Ethan, always curious, tried to open it. "It's locked," he muttered, giving it a few sharp tugs. The handle wouldn't budge. "Maybe the key is somewhere," Sarah suggested. "Could be just an old storage area." But the locked door unnerved me. It was different from the rest of the cabin, as if it wasn't supposed to be there. The silence pressed harder, and we eventually moved on, leaving the door to its mystery. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled louder outside, and the floorboards creaked with every shift in the house. I woke several times, sensing something just beyond the edge of the dark. But no one else seemed bothered, and eventually I pushed it aside. The next day, curiosity got the better of us. Ethan managed to locate an old set of keys hidden in a cabinet, and without a word, he went straight for the basement door. The creak of the lock echoed through the room as he turned the key, and the door slowly swung open. The basement was unlike anything we expected. Instead of dust and cobwebs, the room was pristine, almost too clean. The concrete floor gleamed faintly, lit by a single flickering bulb overhead. Along the walls were shelves stocked with jars, each containing strange objects: feathers, bones, scraps of cloth, and things that couldn't be easily identified. We exchanged uneasy glances. "This is weird," Sarah whispered. Ethan stepped further inside, inspecting the contents. "Looks like some kind of collection," he said, his voice strained. "But what for?" As I moved closer to examine a jar filled with tangled wires, I noticed something written in faded ink on the walls. Symbols I couldn't recognize, arranged in strange patterns. The air grew colder with each passing second, and a faint, whispering voice echoed softly in the back of my mind. "Leave." I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The others turned toward me, their expressions as pale as mine. "What was that?" I breathed, my voice shaking. "It was nothing," Ethan said quickly, though his own face betrayed his discomfort. "Just the house settling." But I wasn't convinced. The whispers grew louder now, speaking directly to each of us. They weren't words, not exactly, just a feeling, a command that pressed into our minds. Leave. We couldn't take it any longer. The basement felt like it was closing in on us, the walls moving ever so slightly inward. We rushed back upstairs, slamming the door shut behind us, but the whispers didn't stop. We tried to distract ourselves with games, but the unease followed. The fire had burned low, flickering in the corner like it wasn't meant to be there. Shadows loomed over the walls, shifting when we weren't looking directly at them. The whispers became insistent, growing louder even when no one was speaking aloud. Leave. This time, it was stronger, an undeniable presence pressing into our thoughts. The air felt thick, oppressive, suffocating. We couldn't escape it. In a panic, we searched for the keys, anything to seal the basement shut once more. But the keys were gone. Gone. Disappeared from the cabinet where we found them. No, Sarah choked out, her voice barely audible. "They can't be." Suddenly, the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. The whispers grew deafening now, each word crashing against our ears like a tidal wave. We screamed, but no sound escaped. When the lights came back on, the basement door stood ajar once again. And the jars, those strange, unsettling jars, were empty. The symbols on the walls had shifted, more vivid now, burning into the very foundation of the house. The wind howled outside, but it was no longer just the wind. It was something else, something hungry, something alive. Leave. We stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape. The cabin was collapsing around us and the whispers grew deafening, echoing in our very bones. But no matter how far we ran, no matter how far we drove, the whispers followed. They always follow. The basement is still there. Locked or not, it's watching. And it whispers my name, louder every night. It started with a quiet invitation. My friend Rachel's message popped up on my phone. "Come stay at the lake house with us this weekend. It's been way too long." The thought of a peaceful weekend by the water sounded perfect. No phones, no city noise, just the calm of nature. I agreed instantly. The drive to the secluded lake house was peaceful at first, surrounded by trees that whispered in the breeze. The road was barely more than a narrow path through the forest, winding its way deeper into isolation. When I arrived, the house sat at the edge of the lake, a weathered wooden structure with shutters creaking softly in the breeze. The porch wrapped around the front, overlooking the still water. Inside, Rachel and a few others were gathered, playing cards and reminiscing. The atmosphere was warm, the smell of a roaring fire filling the rooms. We shared stories, laughing about old times, but the house felt different, quieter than it should have been. Later that night, Rachel pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook from a drawer in the living room. "I found this in the attic," she said. It was hidden under some old boxes. The cover was covered in faded symbols, and the pages inside were filled with bizarre accounts of the lake. Stories of people who had come and never left. The first few stories were typical lake myths, boogeymen lurking beneath the surface, strange lights in the water at night. But as Rachel read on, a chill ran down my spine. The entries became more vivid, more disturbing. One in particular stood out. They watch you from the water. Their eyes follow you deeper than the surface. And when you sleep, they call you by name. The room fell silent. The fire hissed quietly, casting shifting shadows along the walls. Rachel continued, but her voice trembled as she read the next entry. Suddenly, the sound of splashing came from outside, soft, almost gentle. We all froze. The lake had been calm all evening, not a single ripple disturbing its surface. Yet, the sound of something moving beneath the water wasn't something you could ignore. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered. Rachel nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "It happens every time I read this. They don't like being spoken about." The fire flickered and dimmed for a moment, the room becoming eerily cold. The silence stretched longer, heavier, until the whispers began. Not voices, but whispers, too low to be heard clearly, just the faintest breath brushing against the back of our necks. "Stop reading," someone finally said, but Rachel couldn't stop. The whispers grew louder with every word she spoke. "Listen for them at night. They don't sleep. They don't rest. They wait for you to close your eyes." Rachel slammed the book shut. The whispers stopped instantly, but the stillness that followed was suffocating. Outside, the lake had turned darker, almost unnatural. No moonlight touched the surface. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire. Someone tried to break the silence, but the voice caught in their throat. Outside the window, the water began to ripple. It wasn't a natural movement. It twisted and distorted in places, as if something unseen moved just beneath the surface. We huddled together, trying to comfort one another, but it was no use. The whispers had returned, louder this time, closer. One by one, we heard them. Faint, breathy voices calling out names we couldn't recognize. Voices that seemed to echo from the depths of the lake itself. "I can't take this," someone finally said, pushing open the door. We pleaded for them not to go, but they didn't listen. A wave of cold air rushed into the room, and the door slammed shut behind them. We ran to the window, watching the stillness of the water. There was nothing. No figure, no movement, only the darkness beneath the surface. But the whispers didn't stop. Hours passed, or so it felt. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. We sat frozen, listening, waiting for something that might never come. Suddenly, the door creaked open again. Slowly, we turned toward it, and there, just outside, stood our missing friend, pale and drenched, with no memory of how they had gotten back. The whispers faded. The lake returned to calm, but none of us dared to speak, lest we awaken the darkness again. We locked the door, extinguished the fire, and huddled together in silence. By morning, we were gone, driven away by something we couldn't see, something that still watched us from the water's edge, and when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faintest whispers, soft, haunting, always calling, always watching. It started the same way all our getaways did. An invitation from old friends to spend the weekend at a remote cabin deep in the woods. The drive was long, twisting through narrow mountain roads with towering trees hemming us in on either side. The sun was just a distant glow by the time I arrived. The cabin itself was small, a weathered wooden structure perched on the edge of a dense forest. It had been in our friend group for years, a perfect escape from the noise of the city. But something felt off this time. The air was too quiet, the woods too still. Inside, the others had already started setting up. Sarah was bustling around in the kitchen, preparing snacks and drinks, while Jake and his girlfriend Mia set up the fire. The tension in the air was subtle, but present. We exchanged a few uneasy glances, the kind that come when you're surrounded by something unfamiliar, something watching. Later that evening, after the sun had fully set, we gathered in the living room to share stories. Sarah brought out an old photo album, memories from past trips, full of smiles and laughter. But as we flipped through the pages, the atmosphere grew heavier. In the last few pages, there was a photograph that none of us remembered. It was an image of the cabin's porch, taken from the forest. Not from inside the cabin, but from the trees. A blurred figure stood near the edge, its face obscured by shadows. The sight made our skin crawl. "What is that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. None of us could answer. We flipped the page quickly, but the next photo showed something else. More blurry shapes moving between the trees, shadows that shouldn't have been there. Ethan found a small journal hidden beneath the last photo. Inside were strange writings, recounting eerie experiences of people being watched, followed, from the woods. The entries spoke of a figure that appears in the corners of your vision, a figure that never comes fully into view. "It's probably just an old prank," Jake said, trying to brush it off, but even his voice trembled. The fire flickered wildly, casting strange elongated shadows against the walls. As the night wore on, the cabin felt heavier. We tried to sleep, but the silence outside was oppressive. The wind outside began to howl, louder and more unnatural than any breeze we had heard before. I woke to the sound of faint tapping on the window, the kind of sound that could be ignored in any other setting. But here, in the dark, isolated woods, it was impossible to dismiss. I sat up, listening. The tapping grew faster, more insistent. "Guys," I whispered, nudging Jake. He stirred, groggy and confused, but then his eyes widened as the tapping continued. We could hear it now, deliberate, deliberate against the glass. "Maybe it's just a branch," Sarah murmured, her voice shaky as she turned on a flashlight, pointing it at the window. Nothing was there, only the dark reflection of the cabin and the stillness of the trees outside. But then we saw it, the shadowed figure, just at the edge of the light, staring in through the window. It moved when we turned the flashlight toward it, retreating back into the woods, only for more tapping to start again at another window. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The others were frozen, their faces pale, eyes glued to the windows, scanning for movement. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. But as we tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. No matter how much we pushed or pulled, the door was locked from the outside. We screamed, beating against the wood, but the tapping continued, coming from all directions now. Then, from the farthest window, we heard it. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but close enough to whisper directly into our minds. "Stay." The cabin was suffocating now, the walls closing in, the fire burning dim and distorted. The figure returned to the window, standing motionless just beyond the glass. It was watching us, unblinking, its shadow moving unnaturally slow. "Run!" I screamed, and we surged toward the door again, this time breaking through with sheer panic. Outside, the woods were alive, trees swaying unnaturally, their branches grasping for us like skeletal hands. The whispers followed us, quiet but insistent. We stumbled into the darkness, the forest wrapping around us tighter with each step. No matter how far we ran, the whispers were there, urging, guiding. The woods knew we couldn't escape. They were watching, always watching. It started with a simple invitation. "Hey, want to spend the weekend at my family's old lake house?" Sarah's text popped up on my phone late Friday evening. I hadn't seen her in months, and the idea of escaping to a remote lake sounded perfect. The drive wasn't long, but the last stretch was unsettling. The road leading to the house was narrow and lined with towering trees that seemed to press in from both sides, blocking out the sky. The sun had long since set by the time I finally reached the cabin. Sarah was waiting at the door with a warm smile, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her younger brother, Ben, helped carry my bags inside. The house was charming in a rustic way, wood-paneled walls, creaking floorboards, and a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. But something about the stillness felt off. That night, we gathered by the fire, swapping stories about our childhood trips to the lake. Sarah was animated, her eyes lighting up with each memory, but Ben sat quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on the shadows flickering across the walls. "Ben, are you okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. He shrugged but didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out an old battered journal. "Found this in the attic," he said, handing it to Sarah. "Thought it was just an old family scrapbook." She flipped through the pages, her expression quickly shifting from curious to uneasy. "These aren't family stories," she said softly. The journal was filled with tales of the lake and its surroundings, stories of whispers in the dark, figures standing at the edge of the woods, eyes watching from the water. "We've heard these before," Sarah added, trying to sound nonchalant, though her voice wavered slightly. "Just old ghost stories." But Ben's eyes were locked on something further in the journal. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an entry that had been hastily scrawled in darker ink. "They come when the moon is highest. They walk silently, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They stand by the shore and call to you." The room grew colder, the fire flickering unnaturally. "Let's close it," I said, pushing the journal back toward Ben. "Maybe it's just a local legend." But Sarah was already turning the next page. The writing wasn't as smooth this time. It was frantic, almost desperate. "They wait until you sleep. They enter through the dreams, whispering your name until you wake, helpless to move. We stared at the page in silence, the air thick with unease. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Suddenly, the sound of water lapping against the shore echoed through the night. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice low. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah suggested quickly. The warmth of the fire felt distant, the shadows twisting in ways they shouldn't. I awoke hours later, my body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only sound the steady hum of the wind. My phone displayed 3:03 a.m. The air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. Then I heard it, faint whispers from the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. "Sarah?" I called out hoarsely, but the words barely left my mouth. No response. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices weaving through the stillness, saying things I couldn't understand. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt pinned down, paralyzed by the suffocating darkness. Suddenly, a faint figure appeared at the edge of the room, a shadow with hollow eyes and a pale, distorted face. It wasn't human. Its mouth moved silently, but I could feel it calling my name, over and over again. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My vision blurred, and the whispering grew louder, consuming everything. Then, as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. The figure disappeared. The room returned to silence. I gasped for air, my chest heaving. When I opened my eyes again, the faintest glow of dawn was creeping through the window. My limbs felt like they were on fire, but I could move. I stumbled out of bed, checking the room. Sarah and Ben were still, sound asleep. I couldn't wake them, no matter how hard I tried. Their faces were calm, peaceful, as if they weren't really there. Panicked, I ran outside. The lake stretched before me, calm and serene. But something was off. The stillness was unnatural, too complete. I circled back to the cabin, my breath coming in short bursts. The journal was gone. By the time Sarah and Ben woke up, I couldn't explain what had happened. All I knew was that something had reached inside my dreams, pulling me into a nightmare where no one could save me. And even though the house stood untouched, the lake still whispered my name beneath the surface. The house was isolated, tucked deep into a small wooded area far from the city. I figured a fresh start in a quiet place would be exactly what I needed. When I arrived, the place seemed odd. The house was beautiful, with tall, elegant windows, and a wide porch lined with faded wooden rocking chairs. But the air felt stale, as though it hadn't been touched in years. The previous tenant had left abruptly, and the realtor wouldn't offer much explanation. "Just needs some work," she said, her voice tight. I moved in anyway. The first few nights were uneventful. The old creaky floors were the worst part. Every step echoed through the house like a ghostly heartbeat. The few possessions I had were sparse, but enough to get by. That's when I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, whispers in the darkness, soft voices calling out like they were right behind me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the house settling. But as the days went on, the sounds grew louder. Sometimes it felt like someone was right next to me, their breath on my ear, even though no one was there. I began to leave lights on all night. It didn't stop the whispers, but at least they seemed farther away. Then came the dreams. Dreams where I was in the house, but not really. The rooms stretched unnaturally, doorways appearing where there weren't supposed to be any. One night, I dreamt of the room, a room I had never seen before. When I woke up, I felt disoriented, as though I had wandered somewhere in the house I wasn't meant to go. The dream room was vivid, cold, with a deep sense of wrongness. I convinced myself it was just a dream, a trick of the mind. But then it happened again the next night, and the next. Every time, I found myself in the same place, a dimly lit space with walls that seemed to shift, as if the room wasn't static, wasn't real. Each time, the whispers grew louder. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when the whispers returned. This time, though, they were different. They spoke my name, not just once, but in a rhythmic chant that echoed through the air, pulling at my very thoughts. I slammed the book shut and stumbled to my feet, the whispers silencing the moment I moved. I knew something was wrong. I couldn't stay. The next morning, I tried to leave, but when I reached the front door, I found it locked from the inside. A black keyhole sealed shut as if the house refused to let me out. I screamed and pounded on the door, but no one came. Desperate, I searched through the house. Every room was the same, empty, yet oppressive. That was when I remembered the dream, the room I had never seen. I needed to find it. The next dream was different. The whispers guided me, leading me down a hall that wasn't there the night before. I followed blindly, my body moving on its own until I stood before the door. It wasn't like the others. The handle was ice cold, and no matter how much I pulled, it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the whispers again, but this time they weren't coming from outside the door. They were inside, whispering words that made my skin crawl. "Come in." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to enter, but something compelled me, an overwhelming sense of inevitability. I reached for the handle one last time, and this time it turned. The room was hollow, empty, save for a single ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. The glass shimmered unnaturally, reflecting more than just my image. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, circling the room. "Look." I moved toward the mirror, though my body felt foreign, not quite my own. The reflection didn't match the house. I knew. The mirror revealed something else, a different house, decayed and twisted, surrounded by an endless forest of shadows. "Look deeper," the whispers urged, their voices almost melodic now. I did. I saw the other room, the real one. It wasn't empty. It was filled with figures, shadowy, faceless entities that didn't move like people. They swayed, shifting between existence and non-existence, their whispers vibrating in the air. "No," I whispered, but it felt like the room answered, for me. "You'll stay." The mirror shattered. The sound echoed, but the shards didn't fall to the ground. They hung in the air, suspended in a grotesque dance. The whispers stopped. I awoke with a jolt, my body racked with terror. The room was gone. The hallway stretched normally, the door to my room solid and untouched. I ran outside, desperate, to escape the house, but the landscape was wrong. The trees stood still, watching. I've tried to leave countless times, but the house always brings me back. I've never seen the room again, but the whispers still follow me, whispering my name in the dark, pulling me deeper into a place that isn't meant for me. I don't know if I'll ever get out, and truthfully, I'm not sure I want to anymore. It started with a wrong turn, a simple mistake on a winding country road. I was supposed to be heading to a small bed and breakfast outside of town, but the GPS had led me down an unfamiliar path deep into the woods. The sun was dipping low, casting eerie shadows between the tall, twisted trees. I drove slowly, the thick underbrush pressing in on either side of the road, the darkness growing heavier with every mile. The forest seemed to hum with a low, unnatural energy, and the air inside the car felt suffocating. Suddenly, I saw it, a small cabin tucked away behind a grove of ancient pines. Its windows were dark, and the front door hung slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over, stepping out into the quiet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in a breeze that didn't quite feel natural. I approached the cabin slowly, the worn wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. Inside, the cabin was cold, the fire long extinguished in the stone hearth. Dust coated every surface, and the smell of something stale lingered in the air. On the old kitchen table lay a pocket watch, tarnished and still ticking, though it shouldn't have been. There was no battery, no power source, yet the second hand moved with slow precision, ticking out the passage of time in the stillness. Unease settled over me. I picked up the watch, expecting it to be broken, but the cold metal felt real, its pulse steady in my hand. As I studied it, I realized the face was empty. Not a single number, no hour markers, just the ticking second hand, frozen in place. Suddenly, the quiet shattered. A whisper brushed past my ear, a voice I couldn't place, speaking without sound. "You shouldn't have touched it." I dropped the watch, spinning around to face the empty room. The air was thick, like something unseen pressed in around me. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You can't put it back." Panic set in. I fumbled toward the door, but before I could reach it, the door slammed shut. The windows blackened, the light dimming until the room was cast in shadow. My breath hitched, heart pounding against my ribs as I struggled to think, to move. The ticking of the watch grew louder, resonating in the stillness. It seemed to vibrate through the air, echoing around me as though the cabin itself had come alive. I backed away, the whisper growing closer, its voice now a chilling melody weaving into my mind. "It never stops," the voice hissed. "It watches. It waits." I stumbled toward the door again, pushing with all my strength. It refused to budge. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and contorting into shapes that I couldn't quite make out. Then, in the corner of my vision, a figure began to form. A silhouette of a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a shadowed veil. The watch was clutched in his hand, its silent ticking the only sound in the room. "Time is everything," he said, his voice hollow, almost robotic. "And once you've taken it, you can never leave." The fear surged, driving me to the brink of desperation. I screamed, a sound that echoed through the darkness. But the figure didn't move. He only stood there, unmoving, silent, watching. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper faded. The ticking slowed, then stopped altogether. The shadows receded, the oppressive weight lifting. The door creaked open, sunlight flooding back into the room. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. Outside, the forest stood still, but I knew better than to stay. I grabbed my things and fled down the road, my hands trembling, my mind reeling. As I reached my car, I glanced back one last time. The cabin was empty, just a wooden shell, weathered and worn, but the memory of the watch's empty face still haunted me. To this day, I never touch a watch without numbers, never step near an unfamiliar cabin in the woods. Some things are better left untouched, especially when they whisper your name. It started with an invitation I couldn't refuse. My best friend, Mia, had just moved into an old house in the countryside, and she begged me to come visit. The place was surrounded by woods, isolated from the nearest town. "You'll love it," she said, her excitement contagious. How could I say no? The drive took hours. The countryside grew darker with every mile. The dense trees lining the road seemed to close in around us, their branches swaying eerily in the wind. By the time I arrived, the sky had turned a deep, oppressive black, and the house sat in near total silence. Mia greeted me at the front door, her smile hiding a nervous edge. "Welcome to my little piece of hell," she joked, but her laugh didn't reach her eyes. She explained that the house had been in her family for generations, and no one ever really lived there full time. It felt like the house didn't want visitors. That night, we explored the house. Its ancient wooden floors creaked beneath our steps. There were rooms left untouched for years, locked doors that led to nowhere, and long hallways that seemed to stretch forever. One room, in particular, stood out. The door was old and faded, with no handle, just a strange symbol etched into the wood. Mia had never dared open it. "You don't go near that one," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been locked for as long as I can remember." Curiosity gnawed at me. That night, while Mia slept, I found my way back to the forbidden door. It stood just down the hall, shrouded in shadows, the symbol carved into the wood, more vivid in the dim light. I pressed my ear to the door, but there was nothing. No sound, no creak of the floorboards, just silence. Slowly, I reached out and pushed the door. It didn't budge at first, but with a quiet, reluctant groan, it began to swing open. Inside was a room unlike any other in the house. Dust-covered furniture was piled against the walls, forgotten and decayed. The air was thick, stale, with a strange metallic scent. On the far wall was a mirror, cracked and warped, showing distorted reflections of the room beyond. But what caught my breath was the writing. In the center of the room, etched into the floorboards, were words, not in English or any language I knew. They were thin, delicate lines that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. As I moved closer, I could hear a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Soft voices in a language that didn't exist. "Close the door," they hissed, the sound echoing inside my head. "You shouldn't have come here." Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. The silence was almost deafening now, but I could still feel the weight of those whispers lingering in the room. When I returned to my room, Mia was awake, her face pale. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "The room, I opened it," I admitted, guilt washing over me. "It's not supposed to be opened," she said, her breath hitching. "No one goes in there, ever." That night, sleep didn't come easily. The house seemed alive, the shadows moving unnaturally across the walls. I dreamt of the room, its whispers weaving through my thoughts. They weren't just voices. They were thoughts, memories, things I couldn't understand. In the morning, Mia was gone. Her bed was empty, the sheets untouched. I searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. The only thing left was that door, still closed, still sealed, but I could feel it pulling me, whispering my name now. I haven't left the house since. The door still stands, and the whispers are louder. They tell me things I don't understand, things I'm afraid to know. Sometimes I think they're trying to tell me how to open it again, but I won't, not again. The old schoolhouse sat on the edge of the town, abandoned for decades. No one had stepped foot inside since the day it was shut down, and rumors had long since spread about its eerie history. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted, by the spirits of students who never left. Regardless of the truth, the building stood as a silent reminder of a time long past, a forgotten place where history and something darker seemed to blend together. It was a rainy Friday evening when my friends and I decided to explore. Jake, Emma, and I parked our car at the edge of the empty field where the school once stood. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered and the wooden siding warped with age. The air was thick with dampness, and the only sounds were the whispers of the wind and the occasional distant thunder. We stepped inside carefully, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath our weight. Dust floated in the dim light from broken windows, creating ghostly shapes in the still air. The smell of decay hung in the shadows, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "This place feels off," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jake scoffed. "Come on, Em, it's just an old building." He always played the skeptic, but even he seemed uneasy. We explored the empty classrooms, the desks overturned, the blackboards cracked and faded. But the deeper we went, the colder it became. The feeling of being watched intensified. The windows rattled slightly as a gust of wind pushed through, sending chills down our spines. Then, in the dim light of a broken hallway, we found it. A single, untouched photograph pinned to the wall. It was faded, worn at the edges, but clear enough to see. A group of children stood in front of the schoolhouse, smiling, except for one. A little girl with dark hair and hollow eyes stared directly at the camera, her expression hollow and unsettling. "Who would leave this here?" I whispered, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Emma shook her head. "There's no way it's been here all this time." As we moved deeper into the school, the air grew colder. A low hum echoed faintly through the halls, a sound barely noticeable at first, like the breath of someone standing too close, but as we advanced, it grew louder, deeper, almost like a voice. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper now. The hum became a chant, a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, words we couldn't understand. It wasn't coming from any room or hallway, but from the very walls themselves. The building seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating with an unnatural energy. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. Our breath fogged, in the air, and I could see my hands trembling at my sides. The voices were no longer distant. They were inside our heads, filling the space with a relentless presence. I think we should leave," Emma said, her voice breaking. Jake turned. To her, his face pale. "It's not that simple," he whispered. We're not alone." The photograph was gone. The wall where it once hung was smooth, clean as if nothing had ever been there, and the little girl's hollow gaze was in my mind now, her voice haunting my thoughts. "Get out!" The voice burst from the walls, deafening and harsh. We screamed as the floor beneath us shifted, shaking with unnatural force. The windows shattered, sending shards of glass flying into the darkness outside. We bolted for the door, pushing through the oppressive air. My foot caught on a piece of wood, sending me tumbling to the floor. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw her again, the little girl with hollow eyes. She stood at the end of the hallway, her figure fading in and out of focus with every breath of wind. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Jake and Emma along with me. The sound of the chanting voices became a deafening roar as we pushed through the front doors. We didn't look back. We ran into the field, away from the cursed schoolhouse. The storm had begun in earnest now, the rain pounding against us, but none of us dared to stop. We kept running until we were miles away, the town lights shimmering faintly in the distance. Breathing heavily, we collapsed onto the damp grass, gasping for air. The schoolhouse was gone, but the whispers still echoed in our minds, a haunting presence that refused to be silenced. None of us spoke for a long time. Some things, it seems, are better left alone. It was a late summer night when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip into the woods. We packed a few essentials, flashlights, snacks, and a blanket, and drove out to a secluded trail far from the nearest town. The air was warm, but it carried a heavy sense of stillness, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The sun had long since set by the time we parked the car and stepped into the forest. The trail was overgrown, narrow, and winding. Trees loomed above us like dark sentinels, their branches reaching toward the sky in twisted shapes. A constant low hum of insects surrounded us, but as we ventured deeper, that sound began to fade into silence. It was like the woods were swallowing us whole. We joked at first, telling stories about local legends and ghost sightings, trying to shake the growing unease. But the deeper we went, the quieter the forest became, until even our own voices seemed distant. Then we heard it, a faint, rasping breath just beyond our hearing. My friend Hannah stopped mid-step, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Did you hear that?" "Nothing," I said, brushing it off, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was out there, watching us. The trail twisted again, this time leading toward an old, rotted wooden cabin. Its windows were dark, covered with layers of grime, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. No one had stepped inside for years. "Let's check it out," James said, grinning nervously. "No way," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "We need to turn back." But curiosity got the better of them, and Hannah pushed open the door. It groaned loudly on its hinges, the sound reverberating through the still woods. Dust floated in the dim light, settling into the thick air. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a lone, tattered armchair facing the fireplace as though waiting for someone to return. "Let's go," I urged again, but nobody listened. The room seemed colder than before. Shadows stretched across the walls, pooling in corners like dark, shifting pools of ink. We could feel eyes watching us, unseen and omnipresent. Every step we took felt heavier, slower. Suddenly, the breath returned, sharp, ragged, impossibly close. It whispered through the room like a ghost. I turned quickly, my flashlight beam sweeping over the empty space. Nothing but the dust, the fireplace, and the oppressive darkness. Hannah screamed. She had seen something, or someone, in the reflection of the glass in the cabin's broken window. A gaunt face, hollow eyes, and a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide. "Run!" she shrieked, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind us with a resounding crash, and the world outside was no longer familiar. The forest had changed. The trees were closer, their twisted branches clawing at the air, and the shadows had grown taller, hunched and moving like grotesque figures. We bolted down the trail, desperate to escape the suffocating woods. But every path seemed to loop back on itself, every direction twisted into darkness. Our flashlights flickered erratically, revealing glimpses of the things lurking just beyond the edge of sight. More faces, more whispers, and more shadows that seemed almost alive. When we finally emerged from the woods, gasping for breath, we found ourselves back at the car. The air was crisp and still, but the forest behind us remained silent, watching. None of us spoke as we drove away. We didn't look back. The old house had been in our family for generations, sitting alone on the edge of town where the forest began to creep in. It was a place full of memories, both happy and strange, but none of us had ever ventured into the basement. The stories had always been there, whispered between family members in hushed tones, rumors of things unseen, of a door that led to something dark and ancient. It was a rainy evening when my curiosity finally got the better of me. The storm had been brewing all day, and the house seemed quieter than usual. I found myself standing at the basement door, the heavy old wood worn with age. The air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house above. I hesitated. The tales told of strange noises echoing from the basement. Whispers carried through the narrow gaps, dragging voices that spoke in languages long forgotten. But tonight, something felt different. The silence was absolute. No creaks from the floorboards, no wind rattling the windows. Just stillness. Curiosity outweighed fear. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob and pushed. The door resisted at first, but with a firm shove it swung open into darkness. The staircase leading down was narrow and twisted, illuminated only by the faint glow of my phone's flashlight. Each step echoed louder than I expected, the creaks of the old wood unnerving in the quiet. I descended deeper into the basement, the temperature dropping with every footfall. The walls seemed to close in slightly, the air thickening with a strange energy. At the bottom, I reached the familiar concrete floor, cold and smooth beneath my feet. That's when I saw it. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, but there was something different about the far wall. A door. It was solid, made of metal, and stood out starkly against the old stone. My breath hitched. It wasn't supposed to be there. The basement had always been empty, unfinished, and yet there it stood, ominous and locked tight. I tried the handle, expecting resistance, but it turned easily. The door opened with a slow, heavy creak. Beyond, there was only blackness. Not a typical basement darkness, but something deeper, more suffocating. I hesitated again, the chill biting at my skin. The whispers started as a low hum in the back of my mind, a sound that wasn't quite a voice but something more primal, more insistent. They whispered names, fragments of words that didn't belong to any language I knew. Despite the fear clawing at my senses, I pushed forward into the darkness. The room was cold, with a faint smell of decay in the air. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting behind that door for a very long time. The whispers grew louder as I moved deeper into the space, surrounding me like a dark tide. They were no longer words, just a maddening, endless hum that seemed to come from within my own mind. My breath hitched and my pulse quickened with each step. Suddenly, I froze. In the corner of the room, something shifted. A figure, not human, not entirely. Its shape was fluid, shifting between shadow and substance, its outline distorted by the oppressive darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, red and empty, piercing through the blackness like embers. "Leave," it whispered, its voice hollow and inhuman. "You shouldn't be here." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The room seemed to tighten around me, the walls closing in further. The entity moved slowly towards me, its form bending unnaturally. "Go," it hissed again. "You will wake them." The panic surged, but I forced myself to turn and climb back toward the door. The whispers escalated, their volume unbearable. "Leave! Leave!" As my hand touched the metal handle once more, the darkness behind me lunged forward, a wave of shadowy tendrils reaching out to grasp my legs. It was late evening when we left the small town behind. The sun had long since set, leaving the horizon a dull orange glow as we drove down the winding country road. The headlights barely cut through the dense trees lining either side, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and pine. Just a few of us had decided on this spontaneous road trip. My best friend Rachel sat beside me in the passenger seat, while our two friends, Ben and Lisa, followed behind in a separate car. The road had been quiet for miles. No other cars, no signs of life. The distant hum of cicadas was the only sound. "It's getting darker," Rachel said, her voice tense. "Maybe we should stop soon." "We're fine," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "There's a small town up ahead, right?" I checked the GPS again, but the signal had been spotty for the last hour. It kept flashing between bars, as though the road itself was swallowing the signal. I sighed, turning the volume down on the radio. Static hissed, occasionally punctuated by distant whispers I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, the car jolted slightly. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop on the side of the road. "What the hell?" I whispered, looking down at the dashboard. A deep scratch ran along the side of the car, an unnatural, jagged mark. "What was that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. We both stepped out of the car to inspect the damage. Nothing was visible in the darkness, no branches, no debris, just the scratch. "Must have been a rock or something," I said, though I wasn't convinced. As we stood there, I noticed Ben and Lisa's car pulling up behind us. They were clearly shaken, too. "We saw something," Lisa said quietly, her voice shaking. "On the road, a figure walking slowly. But there was nothing there when we checked." Rachel and I exchanged a glance, uneasy. The silence seemed to deepen again. The trees seemed to close in, shadows twisting unnaturally as the wind rustled through the leaves. "Let's just keep moving," I urged, though I wasn't sure if that was the right decision. The road ahead was even darker, more isolated. We drove in tense silence, but no matter how far we went, it felt like we were going in circles. The road didn't seem to end. The GPS was completely frozen now, the screen showing a blank map with no roads, no towns, just an endless expanse of black. Every now and then, we caught glimpses of something at the edge of the headlights, a shadow, a silhouette, fleeting and elusive, barely discernible before vanishing completely. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching. "Did you see that?" Rachel asked, gripping my arm tightly as we passed a bend. Her voice shook. I didn't need to ask what she was talking about. Every turn, every glance into the rearview mirror was met with unease. Finally, the road straightened out and there was a slight incline ahead. The headlights flickered again as we crested the hill, and that's when we saw it, the figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was too tall, too thin, and the features were distorted, lacking a clear face, just an empty, shifting void. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like something inhuman was attempting to walk forward. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure loomed closer, stepping toward us. We could feel its presence, almost tangible in the suffocating air. The static on the radio surged louder, an inhuman scream cutting through the noise before fading again into eerie silence. "We have to get out of here," I managed to say, my voice a whisper. My hands were trembling as I put the car in reverse, tires squealing as I sped backward. The figure didn't follow, at least not immediately, but the fear that it was still there, waiting in the darkness, haunted us. We didn't stop until we found a small roadside motel, miles down the highway. The place was no safer. Creaky floors, flickering lights, and an air of oppressive stillness. But we didn't care. We just needed to put distance between us and whatever we saw. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened on that road. The memory haunts us, an endless, silent expanse of darkness and something beyond our understanding. It was a chilly October evening when my friend and I stumbled upon the old orchard. We were on a weekend camping trip, seeking out isolated places away from the usual trails and campgrounds. This orchard was deep in the woods, a forgotten place that barely showed up on any map. The trees stood tall and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like ancient skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of rotting fruit and earth, and the ground was littered with fallen apples that had long since decayed into a dark mush. Every step we took left us shivering, not from the cold, but from an overwhelming sense of unease. There was no one else around for miles, and yet we felt watched. "We should go back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My friend, Jake, shook his head. "We're fine," he assured me, though his tone lacked conviction. "Let's just check out a bit more, see what's around." We moved deeper into the orchard, where the trees grew so thickly that their twisted branches formed a canopy above us, cutting off the last rays of sunlight. Shadows danced erratically across the ground, flickering like figures just beyond sight. That's when we heard it, a soft, wheezing breath. It was faint, but close. I turned to Jake, my breath hitching in my throat. His eyes were wide, scanning the darkened trees. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no reply, only the rustling of leaves. The air seemed to tighten around us, pressing down harder with each passing second. Suddenly, the sound of an apple hit the ground behind us. A rotten one, falling from the branches above. We both spun around but saw nothing. The orchard was empty. Still, that breath echoed again, close enough this time that I could feel it on the back of my neck. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But Jake wasn't moving. His eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see. His mouth was moving, mouthing words too quietly for me to hear. His breath became labored, shaky. His body shuddered, and a low, guttural voice whispered from behind him. "Leave." It wasn't Jake's voice. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I reached for him, tried to pull him away, but his gaze remained locked on the empty space ahead. His face twisted in a horrible silent scream as the breath grew louder, raspier. Before I could react further, Jake crumpled to his knees. The voice roared then, vibrating through the trees like a nightmare made flesh. I ran, my screams lost in the cacophony of rustling branches and phantom whispers. The orchard seemed to expand, the trees stretching endlessly, their dark silhouettes closing in on me. I stumbled over the crumbling roots and rotting fruit, but I didn't stop running. The last thing I saw before I escaped the edge of the orchard was Jake's still figure, his eyes staring up at the twisted sky, the breath silent once more, echoing in the trees. It was an ordinary evening when my husband and I decided to take a walk through the woods near our new home. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. We had moved here just a few weeks ago, and the quiet seclusion had been one of the main reasons for choosing this area. The woods were vast, with tall, twisted trees stretching toward the sky. We followed a narrow path that curved around a small, stagnant pond. The air was cool and still, and everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was strange how the forest seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "We should turn back soon," I said, squeezing my husband's hand. His grip tightened slightly as we moved deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, we heard a faint humming. It wasn't coming from any direction we could identify. It was low, rhythmic, like a chant that seemed to pulse in sync with the trees. The air grew colder, heavier, and I began to feel uneasy. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my husband replied, his voice strained. The humming grew louder. It was like a song we couldn't understand, the words slithering around in the darkness. We paused, holding our breath, listening. The forest seemed alive. Too alive. Every shadow moved slightly, shifting shapes that were impossible to make out. Suddenly, the path ahead seemed to narrow, the trees closing in on us. The woods felt like a living, breathing entity, and we were lost within it. My phone had no signal, and the sky had turned an unnatural shade of deep blue. A low growl echoed behind us. My husband turned quickly, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there, just more trees. Yet the sound continued, closer now, a raspy, guttural sound that chilled my bones. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, urgency thick in his even voice. We started walking faster, the hum still surrounding us, getting louder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the cold hands of fear gripping at my throat. Then I saw it. A figure. Tall, shadowy, and humanoid, standing at the edge of the trail. Its eyes glowed faintly, a pale, unnatural light cutting through the darkness. I stopped, frozen, unable to move. My husband called my name, his voice distant as if underwater. The figure began to move. Slowly at first, its long, thin arms extending toward us. The humming reached a fever pitch, vibrating in the air like a symphony of madness. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred as if something was bending reality itself around us. "Run!" my husband yelled, yanking me forward. We sprinted through the woods, the figure always just behind us, its presence closing in. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear its whispering voice in my mind. "You're mine now." We didn't stop. The path twisted and turned endlessly, but somehow we kept moving forward. The humming finally faded, and the creature's presence slowly receded, retreating back into the shadows. Breathless and trembling, we broke through the tree line into the clearing near the pond. The sound of the forest was gone, leaving only the distant croak of a frog. My husband dropped to his knees, gasping for air, as I collapsed beside him. What was that?" I whispered. He shook his head, eyes wide. "Something we shouldn't have found." The hollow woods were still. It started as a peaceful getaway. My girlfriend and I had rented a secluded cottage in the countryside, a charming old place surrounded by rolling hills and a garden that stretched far beyond the property's boundaries. The garden was beautiful, at first glance, Wildflowers in full bloom, a stone path winding its way through thick hedges, and an ancient, twisted tree at its center. But as night fell, something shifted. We explored the garden that afternoon, wandering through rows of overgrown plants. There was a strange sense of timelessness, as though the garden wasn't part of the present day. The air grew cooler, and the silence became suffocating. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the hum of insects in the distance. That evening, as we sat on the cottage porch, the sun dipped below the horizon. The garden, once beautiful, began to look eerie. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence deepened into a haunting stillness. My phone had no signal, and the cottage lights flickered faintly whenever a breeze passed through. "We should head back in," I said, my voice a little shaky. My girlfriend nodded, but as we rose to leave, a low, guttural whisper floated through. "The garden." "Stay," it said, smooth and menacing. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My girlfriend clutched my arm tightly, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" I think it's the wind," I managed to say, but even as I spoke, we both knew it wasn't. The whisper came again, this time louder, deeper. It seemed to come from the twisted tree at the garden's center. "Stay. With me." Fear gripped us both as we stumbled back toward the cottage. The path behind us was overrun with vines, the trees seeming to lean in closer, their branches clawing toward us. The garden's beauty had become something grotesque, a maze of shadows, shifting shapes hidden just beyond sight. Inside the cottage, the windows were locked, the doors secured, but we could still hear it, faint breathing from beyond the walls, hollow laughter, and the whisper of "stay." "We need to get out," I whispered urgently, my voice trembling. The lights flickered again, this time fading entirely. The whispers intensified, louder and more desperate. Suddenly, we heard it, an unnatural sound, as if something was moving inside the walls, slithering through the wood like a predator. The cottage shook slightly as if the garden itself was reaching for us. The whispers became frantic, almost pleading. "I won't let you leave," a voice echoed, low, sinister, almost familiar. Panic overtook us. My girlfriend screamed as we slammed open the front door and sprinted back toward the car. The garden was alive, twisting, moving, and snarling in the dark. The ancient tree seemed to loom over us, its branches writhing like dark, clawed tendrils. As we tore down the driveway, the garden shrunk behind us, retreating into the shadows. But we knew it was still there, watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple journey home. The last train had been delayed by hours, and by the time I boarded, the station was nearly empty. The train was old, creaking, with flickering lights overhead and a heavy atmosphere that hung in, the air like a thick fog. I found a seat in the farthest corner, away from everyone else. The train rattled forward into the night, its rhythmic clatter calming at first, but then something changed. The silence began to creep in, almost unnatural. The occasional hum of the wheels and the faint murmur of the engine seemed to fall into a rhythm. Too perfect, too quiet. The few other passengers on board were scattered along the train, but their faces were shadowed by the dim light. They sat motionless, staring ahead, their expressions blank. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing at the other passengers. Their lack of movement unnerved me more than the silence. At the next stop, I noticed something odd. The train didn't slow down. It kept moving forward as if the station didn't exist. Panic began to set in, but before I could react, the doors shut behind me with a loud hiss, locking me inside. The conductor was nowhere to be found. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty car. No response. Only the rhythmic hum of the train and the faint creak of the wheels. I tried to call my family, but there was no signal. My phone buzzed weakly, then died completely. I sat back down, my hands trembling as the train accelerated into complete darkness. There were no more stations ahead, just endless tracks stretching into the unknown. A chill ran down my spine as the figure appeared, just at the end of the car where the next compartment began. It was tall, gaunt, and silent. No face, just a featureless void where its head should have been. Shadows clung to its limbs, unnatural and shifting with each movement. "Who? What are you?" I whispered, pressing myself against the window, but the creature didn't answer. Its form seemed to phase through the train's walls as it glided closer. My breath quickened, the air thickening with dread. I could hear the low, dragging sound of its footsteps against the floor, silent yet menacing. I reached for my flashlight, again flicking it on. The beam barely illuminated the creature before it flickered out entirely, leaving me in darkness. Panic surged through me. The train kept moving faster, the world beyond the windows a blur of night and iron. Every sound, the hum of the train, the creak of metal, grew louder, distorted. The passengers remained frozen, their empty gazes directed forward. "Help me," I shouted, voice breaking as the figure loomed closer. I could feel its cold presence at my side, its shadow casting over me like a suffocating shroud. My hands trembled as I grasped for my phone, desperately trying to call someone, anyone, but the screen remained black. Suddenly, the train's lights went out completely. The darkness was total, smothering. I couldn't see anything. My breath was shallow, a sob threatening to break free. The creature stood beside me, its presence so overwhelming that I felt my mind slipping away. A voice whispered into my ear, a voice without words, without meaning, but its tone resonated deep in my soul. "We're the last." The library was massive, stretching across several floors with endless rows of shelves, books stacked from floor to ceiling. It was old, filled with the scent of aged paper and dust. I worked the late shift, alone, as usual. Every creak in the floorboards seemed magnified in the stillness. The chandeliers above cast long shadows that danced against the walls, but even with the occasional flicker of light, the deeper corners of the library seemed darker, more oppressive. At first, it wasn't anything unusual, just another quiet night with the occasional rustling sound, likely caused by the settling of the old building. But as the hours dragged on, I began to notice things. Subtle, unsettling details that made my skin crawl. I had been shelving a stack of books when I heard a faint whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. I paused, glancing around, but the aisles were empty. The library was eerily quiet once again. Brushing it off, I continued my work. That's when I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing between two shelves. A shadowy figure, unmoving, watching. No details, just a hollow outline of a person, tall and gaunt. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Heart racing, I took a step back, but my foot brushed against something cold. Looking down, I saw a book lying face down on the floor, its pages torn, as though something had been ripped from it. "What the hell?" I muttered. I hurried toward the front desk, heart pounding against my ribs. My fingers fumbled over the phone as I tried to call security. The line went dead. Static hissed through the receiver. The whispers started again, low, almost inaudible at first, but they grew louder with each passing second, creeping into my ears like nails scratching against glass. I turned around slowly. The shadow was closer now, looming between the shelves. The eyes, empty sockets, stared into mine. Empty, lifeless. Its figure seemed to shimmer slightly as though bending the light around it. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The aisles were endless, packed with books and shadows. The whispers reached a fever pitch, rising to a deafening cacophony as the figure moved closer. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the library. A voice that was not mine. A voice that shouldn't have been there, whispering my name. "Who are you?" I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek. Ice cold. My knees buckled and I fell to the ground, my scream echoing through the silent library. The figure towered above me now, its distorted shape twitching unnaturally. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a heavy encyclopedia from a nearby shelf and smashed it against the figure. The hollow shape flickered violently before collapsing into a cloud of black mist. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced by deafening silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When I finally found the courage to stand, the figure was gone. The book on the floor was gone too, along with the ripped pages. The library was empty once more, but I knew I wouldn't forget that night. It had been years since anyone had dared venture near the old well at the edge of town. The stories surrounding it were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange sounds, vanished hikers, and eerie lights that flickered in the dead of night. Most people avoided the well, not out of fear, but out of respect for the ominous legends. But curiosity got the better of me. One late autumn evening, after hearing so many eerie tales, I decided to visit the well alone. My friends had all warned me not to go, but I couldn't resist. The town's ancient history called to me, and the thought of uncovering some forgotten mystery was too tempting. The path to the well was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots. Darkness cloaked the forest, the trees leaning in like they had stories to tell. It was cold, so cold that even my breath formed thick clouds in the air. The faint glimmer of the well came into view as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Well itself was old, crumbling stone with a rusted metal bucket sitting awkwardly in its center. The air felt heavy, unnatural. A sense of dread wrapping around my chest. A dim, flickering lantern hung from the well's side, casting strange shadows that twisted unnaturally in the dark. I set my flashlight on the ground and leaned in close to inspect it. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bottom, a slow, monotonous drip that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the well. It came from behind me, from deeper within the woods. It was a woman's voice, soft yet chilling, almost melodic. She was saying something, but the words were indistinct, like they were spoken in a language, lost to time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I turned back toward the well, gripping my flashlight tightly. The chill deepened and the shadows seemed to shift once again, moving closer, circling the well. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not driven by wind or natural causes. The lantern flickered harder, its flame sputtering as if something unseen was feeding on it. I reached down to retrieve my flashlight, but as my hand brushed the cold metal, I saw it. Faces, hundreds of them, distorted and gray, pressed against the surface of the water at the bottom of the well. The faces were crying. Silent tears slid down their features, blending into the dark water. Their mouths were twisted in expressions of pain and longing, and their eyes, oh their eyes, hollow, empty, and searching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping the silence. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me now, voices overlapping and blending into a terrifying symphony of sorrow. I could hear them pleading, crying out, voices from the well, calling for something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't realize how far I had retreated until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The shadows closed in, their form no longer shapes, but human-like figures. Long, gaunt, with hollow faces and lifeless eyes. Their fingers reached out, elongated and grotesque, dragging across the surface of the well, clawing toward me. "Please," I begged, lifting the flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, pushing them back, but they came closer as if drawn to the light. "Leave!" I screamed, feeling my legs give out beneath me. The figures paused at the edge of the light. They stared at me, not with malice, but with despair. Then they began to fade into the shadows once more, their hollow eyes lingering in the darkness. When I looked back at the well, it was still, silent again, save for the slow drip of water. But the faces remained beneath the surface, watching, always watching. I stumbled back through the forest, my legs shaking, my breath uneven. The well was still behind me, a hollow abyss waiting, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to look inside. And I knew, some mysteries should never be uncovered. It started a year ago. My best friend James invited me to join him on a hiking trip deep into an old forest. "No one's been there for years," he said, eyes lighting up with excitement. I hesitated at first. Forests have their share of eerie stories, but curiosity got the better of me. The hike began as expected. The woods were dense, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. James led the way, his compass guiding us through twists and turns, deeper and deeper into the trees. We left our phones behind, eager to disconnect. The silence was almost unnatural, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. As we ventured further, James pulled out an old leather-bound journal. "Found this in the library," he said, flipping through its pages. "It's from someone who came here years ago. Apparently, they never came back." I raised an eyebrow, but he shrugged it off. "Just a story," he said. Still, something gnawed at me. The pages were filled with strange sketches, trees contorted in unnatural ways, twisted faces peeking from behind them, whispers inked between lines. That's when things started to feel off. The air grew colder, though we were deep into summer. Shadows seemed to move on their own, flickering between trees even when no breeze stirred. James's voice sounded far away when he spoke, his words swallowed by the unnatural stillness. We set up camp by a small stagnant pond. James lit a fire, the flames crackling, casting flickering shadows on the trunks around us. The journal lay, open beside him, revealing more disturbing drawings. Creatures with hollow eyes, their twisted forms looming from the pages. "You okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. James didn't answer. He was fixated on the journal, flipping through the entries quickly as though desperate to find something. Suddenly, he froze. "There's a page missing," he whispered. "What?" I leaned closer, peering at the journal. Sure enough, one of the middle pages was torn out. It was clean, as if deliberately removed. "Someone didn't want us seeing what's there," James said, his voice uneven. "Look." He showed me the next page, completely blank except for a single word scrawled in jagged letters. "Run." We both stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Just then, the fire flickered out. The darkness pressed in around us. The pond behind us rippled unnaturally. The shadows moved faster now, circling our campsite. I could hear whispers, low and desperate, as though something was calling from the trees. James stumbled back from the journal, his face pale. "Something's here," he whispered. I turned in a frantic circle, searching for any glimpse of movement. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices now, but their words were incomprehensible. The trees seemed to stretch toward us, their branches clawing the air, creating an eerie dance of shadows. "We need to leave," I managed to say, my voice quivering. Suddenly, James's flashlight flickered weakly. He dropped it in horror as the darkness swallowed us whole. "I can't see," he choked out. His hands flailed as if reaching for something that wasn't there. I grabbed his arm and started running, the cold dirt beneath my feet desperate to escape. The journal lay forgotten by the fire, its pages fluttering wildly in an invisible wind. We sprinted through the woods, the sound of our own breathing deafening. The shadows stretched out before us, swallowing everything behind. The whispers became screams, and I couldn't tell if they were in my mind or all around us, but we kept running. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The forest fell silent. We stood there, breathless, the air eerily still. The fire was gone, the pond frozen over, the journal lying open where we had left it. The pages were back, no longer blank. But now the words were far darker. You didn't listen. You never should have stayed. Now you're ours. James turned to me, his face pale as death. We're not alone. I shook my head, unable to speak, as the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift. From the corner of my eye, I saw the twisted trees bend toward us, their branches now reaching for us, horrifically alive. And in the distance, I heard a soft whisper, one I will never forget. You can't leave. We moved into the house during the summer. It wasn't anything special, a modest home with chipped paint and a narrow, overgrown yard. Nothing unusual stood out at first, beyond the quiet that settled over the neighborhood. It was peaceful, a bit too peaceful. From the very first night, things felt wrong. The house settled into a silence that was unsettling. No creaks from the floorboards, no rustling of branches against the windows. It was as though the house itself held its breath. At first, we dismissed it. Old houses have their quirks, right? Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe we were just adjusting to the quiet after moving in. But the feeling never went away. The strange occurrences started subtly. Our daughter, Sophie, would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She claimed that someone was standing at the foot of her bed. Always a shadowy figure, never fully there, just a presence. Every time we checked, nothing was there. Her nights became restless, and soon she wouldn't sleep at all without the bedroom door wide open. One evening, we heard a faint, hollow sound coming from the walls. It sounded like whispers, low and distorted, as though a dozen voices were trying to speak at once, but only half-formed. We thought perhaps it was the house settling further into its old age. The realtor said it hadn't been lived in for years before we bought it. But the whispers never faded. They came and went unpredictably, sometimes late at night, sometimes during the day when the house should have been still. Sometimes it sounded like faint laughter, soft, high-pitched, inhuman, and it sent chills down our spines. Then the visions began. I'd see it standing in the corner of rooms, a figure barely discernible in the shadows, always watching, always near but never moving. The more I focused on it, the blurrier it became, like the smoke swirling in the corners of my vision. It was like it didn't want to be fully seen, but it still wanted us to know it was there. One evening, my husband, James, went into the basement to grab a tool. He was down there for what felt like hours before I finally went down to check on him. When I found him, his face was pale, his body frozen. He stared at the far wall, his mouth trembling as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. "What's wrong?" I asked, shaking him gently. Finally, he managed to whisper, "The eyes. They're watching me." I didn't see what he saw, but I felt it, an oppressive, suffocating presence. The whispers had grown louder, and the figure was closer. After that, things escalated quickly. Sophie refused to enter her room alone, her little hands clutching at ours tightly, her tiny voice begging for us to stay with her. Objects would move on their own, the television turning on at odd hours, cupboards slamming shut when no one was near. But the worst part was the feeling. A cold, hollow breath on the back of our necks when we were alone in the house. One night, I woke up to a loud thud from downstairs. I was about to call out, thinking it was just James, but the silence that followed was unlike any sound I'd ever heard. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the noise. I hurried down to check, but no lights worked, no matter how many. Switches I flipped. The only sound was the whispers, insistent now, louder, more desperate, and then I saw it. The figure stood in the living room. Its features were clearer now, grotesque, almost human, but twisted. Skin stretched unnaturally, tight over its bones, empty sockets where the eyes should be, its mouth gaping in an expressionless scream. It didn't move, yet I could feel its presence press against every inch of the room. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the monstrosity in front of me. When James woke up and found me trembling by the doorframe, he couldn't see it. Not at first. I couldn't explain what I had seen, not fully. But when he entered the room, the whispers rose again. Louder, angry, demanding. The figure moved closer. That night we gathered Sophie in the hallway, away from her room. We didn't dare sleep in the house anymore. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the car, not knowing what to do, too terrified to return inside. The next day, we left the house behind. We didn't touch anything, no clothes, no belongings. We simply left it all, retreating back to a rental with no windows into the past. The whispers still haunt us, sometimes when we're alone, sometimes in dreams. The figure isn't gone. It lingers, a dark stain we can't wash away. We've tried to move forward, but we know it's not over, not entirely. The house is quiet now, empty, forgotten by the world. But we know we're not the only ones who feel its pull. And we dread the day someone else steps into that house because we know the whispers will return. And so will the figure, waiting to make itself seen again. The moment I stepped into the auction house, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the building itself. It was old, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was the air, thick and stale, as if it hadn't been aired in years. The low murmur of. The crowd had an eerie quality to it, like everyone was speaking in whispers, yet no one was saying a word. My friends and I had heard about this exclusive auction. The items were said to be from places no one had ever dared explore. Intrigued, we decided to check it out. The room was dim, only a few flickering lights above casting shadows across the tall, marble columns. An old man with a sharp suit stood behind the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. He smiled when he saw us, his lips twisting in a way that didn't seem quite human. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep, like the creaking of old wood. "Tonight, you will have the opportunity to acquire pieces, unlike any you've ever seen." He wasn't wrong. The first item up for auction was an old wooden chest. It looked harmless enough, ancient and worn, the kind of thing you might find in an attic. But when the lid was opened, the smell hit me. It wasn't a smell of old wood or dust. It was a stench of rot, the kind that makes your stomach churn. The chest was empty except for a small handwritten note resting at the bottom. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel its presence, like it was whispering something in my mind. The crowd was oddly still as the auctioneer began his bidding. I turned to my friends, and I could see they were unsettled too. Jake, always the skeptic, leaned in close. "Something's off about this place," he whispered. "Let's get out of here." But something held me in place, an invisible pull that I couldn't ignore. And when the auctioneer called for the next item, I found myself walking toward the front without meaning to. The next piece was even more bizarre. A cracked mirror, its surface distorted in a way that made the reflection look wrong. It warped the image of anyone who looked at it, elongating features, twisting faces into grotesque shapes. The crowd's excitement grew as the bidding began. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The mirror seemed to reach out to me, pulling my gaze, making my heart race. I felt trapped in the reflection, as though I was being sucked in, piece by piece. I forced myself to turn away, and that's when I saw it. The painting. It was hung in the corner of the room, surrounded by shadows. A figure stood there, cloaked in darkness with no clear features, just an absence where its face should have been. But its eyes were unmistakable. I don't know how, but I knew. They were staring directly at me. The auctioneer was still speaking, but his voice had become muffled. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the painting. It felt like the room was closing in around me, the air thick with something unnatural. I could hear the whispers now, but they weren't coming from the crowd. They were coming from the painting, from the empty eyes that followed my every movement. I turned, my pulse pounding in my ears, and ran for the door. But it wouldn't open. Panic rose in my chest. I could hear my friends calling out to me. But the words were drowned out by the increasing whispers growing louder and louder. "You cannot leave." It wasn't in my head. The words were spoken aloud by the painting. Its voice was hollow, distant, as if it came from the deepest recesses of the earth. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally. Across the walls. And then the whispers stopped. The lights flickered. I turned around. The auctioneer was gone. The crowd was gone. The only thing left in the room was the painting, and it was moving. The figure stepped out of the frame, its form no longer a blur of shadow but a solid, dark figure standing in front of me. It was taller than any man I had ever seen, its limbs too long, its body too thin. The face remained empty, a void, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze cutting through me like ice. My friends were gone. The doors were still locked. The room felt endless, the walls bending inward. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, and I felt its coldness like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, with a sudden lurch, I was back in the real world. The auction house was gone. The room was normal again, bright lights crowded with people. But I wasn't alone. I turned to find my friends standing beside me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't seen anything, but they could feel it too, the strange, unnatural presence that still clung to us. We left the building as quickly as we could, never looking back. But the whispers followed us, and I realized then that the auction had never ended. It had only just begun. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum, low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared at me, her voice trembling. "It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable. like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. Get out. The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close. Too close. Run, the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered. Fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out. It was supposed to be a simple day at the park, nothing unusual. Just me, my camera, and a quiet trail leading into the woods. I've always been fond of nature and spent my weekends hiking or exploring different paths, searching for something unique to capture on film. That morning, I packed my camera gear and set out early. The air was crisp and the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I arrived at the trailhead. It was a familiar spot, but this time something felt off. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were missing. Instead, there was silence, the kind that hangs heavy, as if the world itself had gone still. I took a deep breath and shrugged it off, telling myself I was imagining things. As I followed the trail deeper into the woods, the quiet only grew. The trees seemed taller, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The path became narrower, winding between thick undergrowth. I kept walking, ignoring the unease growing in my chest. At one point, I stopped to take a photo. I raised my camera and glanced through the lens. What I saw wasn't the usual forest scene, There was something there, something moving just beyond, the edge of the frame. A figure, tall and obscured by the trees, watching me. My hands shook as I lowered the camera, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I kept moving, trying to push the thought away, but every step felt heavier. The Uitik trail began to thin, and the trees loomed larger, as if they were closing in on me. I glanced behind, but all I could see was the empty path I had come from. I walked until I reached a small clearing, bathed in the dim light filtering through the canopy. It was peaceful, the kind of moment you wish could last forever. But something about the stillness unsettled me. I felt like I was being watched. I set my camera down on a rock and took a seat, staring at the trees that surrounded me. Then I noticed something. A faint whisper, almost inaudible. I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just the wind, until it came again, louder this time. Not quite a whisper, not quite a voice, but something close enough to make my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and began to snap pictures, hoping to capture whatever it was. The shutter clicked again and again, but when I reviewed the images, there was nothing but the forest. A rustling noise came from behind, and I turned sharply, expecting to see an animal. Instead, there was nothing, just the trees, still and unmoving. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was alone. Or so I thought. I heard it again, closer this time, the faint sound of footsteps crunching leaves. I turned slowly, my camera raised, but there was still nothing in sight. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, circling the clearing. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps weren't from an animal. They were from something else. I stumbled backward, keeping my eyes on the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moving between the trees. Its form was distorted, barely human, but I could feel its presence. Its eyes, if it even had them, were black voids, staring straight at me. I turned and ran. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, the sound of those footsteps growing louder behind me. The trees blurred into streaks of green and brown, but I didn't dare stop. My camera swung wildly as I pushed through thorns and branches, the fear coursing through me like electricity. When I finally broke free from the trees, I didn't stop to look back. I ran to my car, throwing open the door and slamming it shut. Behind me, the silence of the forest was replaced by the steady hum of the engine, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel, staring at the woods. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared, but I knew it was still out there, waiting just beyond my sight. It was a clear autumn evening when we decided to take the old dirt road that led up to the old, overgrown orchard. My friends and I had heard stories about the orchard from people in town, though they never seemed to agree on what was true. Some said it was haunted. Others just dismissed it as an old tale. Either way, we figured there was no harm in checking it out. The orchard itself was vast, rows upon rows of crooked, gnarled trees that stretched far beyond where we could see. We wandered through the uneven rows, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet echoing in the stillness. The air was sharp and crisp, but it didn't take long before a chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt off. We stopped near the center of the orchard where a large, ancient tree stood alone. Its trunk was thick and hollow, gnarled like it had seen centuries of storms and time. Its branches stretched out in every direction, but many had broken over the years, leaving it with a twisted, skeletal shape. Something about the tree felt familiar, though none of us could place why. We sat beneath its shade, passing around a flask of whiskey, laughing and joking. The evening felt peaceful, almost too calm. The further we moved from the edges of the orchard, the quieter the world became. It was as though the trees had swallowed all sound. As we sat there, something began to change. The laughter tapered off, and we all felt the weight of the silence settle in around us. I glanced around, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The sky had darkened, casting the orchard in a strange, otherworldly glow. The usual sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the calls of distant birds, were gone. The forest beyond the trees was quiet. Then I noticed something out of place. In the distance, between the twisted trunks of the apple trees, there was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its form barely visible in the shadows. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out what it was. It was too far away to see clearly, but its presence felt wrong. I whispered to my friends, pointing toward the figure. They followed my gaze but saw nothing. "It's just the trees playing tricks on you," one of them said, laughing nervously. "Nothing's there." But I knew what I had seen. I could feel its eyes on me, though there was no way to be sure it even had a face. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to blur, as if it was blending into the darkness itself. Then, as if in response to my fear, it began to move. Slowly, almost deliberately. "Let's head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's not right here." As we made our way toward the edge of the orchard, the atmosphere grew, heavier, suffocating. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted limbs reaching out as though they were watching. The figure was gone now, but I could still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow just beyond my vision. When we reached the dirt road, we didn't speak much. The eerie stillness of the orchard had left us all shaken, and none of us wanted to turn back and look at what might still be lurking behind us. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that we realized we had left something behind. My phone buzzed as we sat around a fire in someone's backyard. It was a message from one of my friends with only one word: "Look closer." Confused, I opened the photo he had sent. It was a blurry shot, taken just as we left the orchard. In the background, barely visible, there was the figure, standing between the trees, its features obscured but still there, watching. We've never gone back to that orchard, and I pray we never do. I've always been a night owl. I'd spend hours driving back roads, listening to music, or just getting lost in thought. One night, I decided to take a different route home, one that looped through fields and quiet country roads. It was the kind of night where the stars felt closer, the sky so vast and clear it seemed to stretch forever. Around 2 a.m., I found myself on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but farmland. The fields stretched out on either side of me, empty and dark, with only the occasional flicker of distant farmhouses. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, isolated but serene. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow. The silhouette was tall and thin, almost too thin, with its arms outstretched like it was waving. I slowed down as I approached, my headlights illuminating it. But it wasn't a scarecrow. It had a face, long, gaunt, and pale, like something that had been buried for years. Its hollow eyes didn't blink, didn't seem to recognize me. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I was frozen, unable to move. The figure didn't shift, didn't run. It just stood there, watching me. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened. My car idled, the engine humming softly. Then, just as I was about to drive away, it moved. Not toward me, but away. It turned slowly and walked into the fields, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. What had I seen? A hallucination? A prank? I drove home that night, my hands trembling on the wheel, but I couldn't forget the image, the figure. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that felt rooted in the very land itself. Even now, years later, I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the fields, waiting for someone to cross its path again. It started as a simple trip to the old lighthouse, a place my family had visited countless times. We used to come here to watch the sunset, the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below, the lighthouse casting its beam out over the water. This time, we decided to stay overnight, hoping for a quiet escape from the routine of life. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary at the edge of the rocky cliffs, its paint peeling and windows grimy from years of neglect. It wasn't operational anymore, but the view from the top was still breathtaking. Vast stretches of sea, endless skies, and the horizon meeting the horizon, uninterrupted. We set up our small tent a little ways down from the lighthouse, out of view from the old structure, and settled in for the evening. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cliffs. As the sky darkened, the air became colder, the saltwater breeze sharp against my face. The sounds of the ocean became louder, more rhythmic, as if the waves themselves were trying to communicate. That's when things started to feel off. The usual quiet of the night was disrupted by strange, faint whispers carried on the wind. I shrugged it off at first, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the whispers weren't constant. They came and went, drifting in and out like ghostly echoes. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. My family was asleep in the tent, oblivious. Then I noticed something peculiar. The lighthouse, standing dark and foreboding, had always felt like a landmark, a safe beacon of light in the darkness. But now it felt different. It wasn't just that it was no longer operational. It felt like it had a presence of its own. I felt watched. I decided to climb up to the lighthouse, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. The inside of the structure was cold and damp, the smell of aged wood and salt overwhelming. Dust particles danced in the faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy windows. I took the stairs to the top, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. At the top of the lighthouse, I stood in awe of the view. But as I looked out across the horizon, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, far below. It was too far for me to make out any details, but it stood motionless, like a statue. I squinted, trying to focus, but the figure didn't move. My heart pounded. I called out, but there was no response. The wind carried my voice away. I wanted to go back down, but something held me there. The figure remained, staring, unmoving. I turned to leave when I heard a sound, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs behind me. My blood ran cold. I was alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I spun around, expecting to see nothing, but there it was. A figure at the top of the stairs, eerily still, its face obscured by the shadows. My breath caught, and I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the figure following, its presence closer now as if it were breathing down my neck. When I reached the bottom, I bolted toward the tent, heart racing, the whispers now louder, more insistent. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers didn't stop. In the morning, when my family woke, there was no sign of the figure, just the sound of the ocean and the wind. But the feeling remained, the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever had watched me from the cliff was still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. A few friends and I decided to escape the city and spend a weekend camping at a secluded lake in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but we'd heard it was quiet, beautiful, and perfect for getting away from the noise of the world. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees as we parked our cars by the edge of the lake. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of dusk like a mirror. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner. The laughter and conversation filled the space, muffled by the stillness of the woods. It was everything we had hoped for: peaceful, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the quiet crackling. The stars appeared, one by one, stretching out into the endless dark sky. The lake reflected them, making it seem as though we were surrounded by an ocean of light. But it wasn't the beauty that started to unsettle me. It was the silence. No wind rustled the trees. No insects chirped, just the crackling fire and the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. It was too quiet, unnatural. I glanced around at my friends who were deep in conversation, unaware of the strange stillness. "I'm going to get some water," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I'll come with." We made our way to the edge of the lake, our footsteps silent on the soft earth. The water was cold and still, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. "Hey," I whispered to my friend. "Do you feel that?" He stopped, looking at me, his face pale under the starlight. "Yeah, something's not right." We stood there for a moment, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint shimmer, like something just beneath the surface of the water. A reflection that wasn't quite right. I turned toward it, heart racing, and saw a figure. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was indistinct, almost fluid, as though it was made of the water itself. It stared at us with hollow eyes, its face obscured by the darkness. I grabbed my friend's arm, my voice trembling. "We need to get back." We ran. Our footsteps thundered in my ears as we sprinted back to the campsite. The trees loomed over us, their branches creaking as if they were watching us too. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on my friends' faces, but none of them seemed to notice our panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I kept hearing whispers in the dark, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure, those hollow, watching eyes beneath the water. At dawn, I gathered my friends and told them what had happened. They didn't believe me. They dismissed it as nerves, as the strange atmosphere of the woods playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. The figure was still out there, waiting beneath the surface of the lake, and I could still feel those hollow eyes watching me, even now. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk in the old neighborhood park that bordered the edge of town. The park wasn't particularly large, but it had always felt familiar, almost like a second home growing up. The trees were tall and ancient, their twisted branches stretching across the paths, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been years since I last wandered through these trails, but I always felt drawn back whenever I needed space to think. As I walked deeper into the park, the air grew cooler, the rustling leaves crunching softly beneath my feet. There were hardly any other people around, which only added to the sense of solitude. I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone. The park was rarely crowded during the evening hours. I figured it would be a peaceful walk, perfect to clear my head after a long day. I passed a small, decrepit wooden bench half buried beneath overgrown vines. It was an old fixture from the days of my childhood. I paused for a moment, staring at the faded graffiti that had long since been swallowed by moss. The bench felt like a quiet witness to countless secrets from the past, memories of old friendships and whispered promises. As I continued along the trail, I noticed the faint sound of running water. A small creek weaved its way through the park, barely noticeable until now. The gentle babble of the stream was oddly calming, and I decided to follow its course. The path led me to a clearing, where the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by tall, leafy trees. The sunset painted the water in hues of amber and gold, reflecting the serene beauty of the surroundings. I sat down by the edge, my feet dipping into the cool, clear water. The sound of the water lapping against the rocks was soothing. I lost track of time, simply sitting there, letting my thoughts wander. The tension from earlier in the day seemed to melt away, replaced by an eerie stillness. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed almost too quiet. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind shifting through the leaves. But as I strained to listen, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. "I'm here." The words were barely more than a breath, carried by the faint breeze. My heart jolted. I glanced around, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, but the clearing remained empty. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The park was known for its stillness, for its isolated atmosphere. Maybe it was just the wind, bending the branches and creating phantom sounds. Still, the voice echoed in my head. "I'm here. Please, stay." My pulse quickened and I stood up, backing away from the water's edge. The feeling of being watched returned, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel something. Something was there, hidden just beyond the trees. I turned and began walking quickly toward the trail. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were moving closer. Each step I took sent chills down my spine. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, I felt it. A cold, bony hand grasping at my arm. I froze, unable to move, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel the cold of its touch, something impossibly dry and lifeless. "I told you." "Stay," the voice whispered again, right next to my ear this time. The air seemed to vibrate around me, thick and suffocating. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the rising panic. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. The grip tightened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Don't leave," the voice continued, quieter this time, almost desperate. "You can't." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip released. I staggered back, my heart pounding, and ran as fast as I could toward the distant glow of the city. I haven't been back to that park since. And every night when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, soft and haunting, reminding me that whatever was there is still waiting. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was a cool, quiet evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the old, deserted forest near my apartment. The trees there have always been tall and ominous, their branches tangled like they were reaching out toward something beyond. I had always felt a strange sense of peace walking through the woods, but that evening was different. It was getting late, and the sky had grown dark, casting everything in a heavy, oppressive silence. I walked further than I usually did, deeper into the forest, the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves the only noise accompanying me. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like someone calling my name. I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. My breath hitched, and I told myself it was just the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. The whisper repeated, growing louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I turned around, heart thudding in my chest. The forest behind me stretched out, dark and still, but there was something off about it. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't have. I hurried back, my legs trembling, but the whisper followed me, always just out of reach. When I got home, I didn't mention it to anyone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, some trick of the mind after spending too much time in the quiet. A week passed and I forgot about the whispers, until the second night. This time, I wasn't walking through the forest. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. Fainter at first, but growing louder. The whispering came from the corner of my room. It was almost like a voice now, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within my mind. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering didn't stop. It was closer now, right by my ear. "Come with me," it said, and the words sent shivers down my spine. I stayed frozen, my eyes wide open, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispering didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to grow louder, more urgent. "You belong with us," it murmured. I covered my ears, but the sound was still there, filling my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed, and I felt a strange emptiness that wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I had heard voices? No one would believe me. Days passed, and everything felt different. The whispering never stopped, though I tried to ignore it. It was always there, when I was alone, when I was in public. It followed me like a shadow, growing louder, more distinct. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront it. I went back to the forest, driven by a need to understand what was happening. As I walked deeper into the trees, the whispering grew louder, until it was almost a scream. Then, in the dead silence of the woods, I saw them. Shapes. Dark figures, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were shadows, but somehow, they felt real. The whispering became clearer. "You hear us now," one said. Its voice wasn't human. It was more like a collective, a chorus of countless voices. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't look away. The figures stretched toward me, their features twisted and distorted as though they had no faces, no identity, just voids of endless blackness. "I don't belong here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures tilted their heads, a soft, eerie sound echoing through the forest. "But you do." I turned to run, but the figures followed as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. The whispering filled my ears, growing louder, until I could hear nothing else. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. I woke up the next morning, lying on the ground, covered in dirt and leaves. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. I was alive, but something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. The whispers have never stopped. They still come to me in the quiet, always closer, always more persistent. And now, I know they'll never let me go. It was just another evening walk through the woods, like countless others I'd taken before. My friends and I had made a habit of these late-night strolls, always curious about what lay beyond the edge of town. The woods were familiar to us, comforting even, filled with tall trees and the rustling of leaves. But that night was different. We set out just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset fading behind us. The air was cool, crisp, and the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as we ventured deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no chirping of crickets, just silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet, though. It felt wrong. We walked on, joking and laughing, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere, but something was off, something I couldn't quite place. My friends seemed oblivious, lost in their chatter, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. As we pushed further, we came across an old, decaying wooden bench, rotted and covered in moss. It wasn't there on our previous walks, that much I was sure of. We decided to stop for a moment, stretching our legs, as if the bench had appeared there just for us. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The silence felt heavier now. I looked around, but there was no sign of the familiar paths we usually walked. The trees felt tighter, as if the woods were closing in. My stomach twisted. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of my friends, Jake, waved me off. "Come on, what's the rush? We've been here a dozen times, there's nothing different." But I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. We continued walking, though my steps grew slower. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and the usual landmarks, the twisted old tree, the hollowed-out log, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest had shifted, or we had. Then came the first sound that shattered the silence, a faint echoing whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, there it was again, a whisper, distant yet near, as though it was calling to me. I stopped, heart racing. My friends turned to look at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of them replied, their tone dismissive. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind. Let's just keep going." We pressed on, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to drift around us as if carried by the very trees themselves. The shadows deepened, casting the woods in an eerie glow. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, its features obscured by the fading light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick. But this figure didn't walk like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and slow, as though it didn't belong to the world we knew. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, like voids of nothingness. "Run," I managed to whisper. But before I could move, my friends stood frozen, transfixed by the figure. I screamed at them to move, but they didn't respond. They were still, staring at the figure like they couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, and I could feel something shift in the air around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements like something out of a nightmare. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were faces. Hundreds, thousands of hollow, empty faces staring back at me from the darkness. Their mouths were open, whispering, calling out in that haunting, otherworldly language. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing against my skin, colder than anything I had ever known. Its breath was a chill, a void of nothingness that seemed to consume everything around me. I could hear my friends murmuring, lost in the whispers of the forest, their eyes wide but unseeing. I was alone now, standing amidst the forest that had become a sea of emptiness, the faces of the trees watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled my ears, louder and louder, until they became all I could hear. And then there was silence. It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house, nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural. Wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friend's rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with a grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter, leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creaking of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip. It was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. "Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here." But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face. Only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was a summer evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned amusement park just outside of town. The place had always been off limits, but rumors had circulated for years about how eerie it had become after being shut down. Overgrown with weeds, faded signage, and cracked pavement stretching as far as the eye could see, the park was a relic from a time long gone. We figured we'd go check it out, just for the thrill of it. The sun was setting as we made our way through the rusting entrance gates. Everything about the place felt surreal. The Ferris wheel, once a shining beacon of joy, stood now as a towering, skeletal structure swaying gently in the breeze. Most of the rides were broken or tilted at odd angles, their once bright colors dulled and faded by years of neglect. We wandered further into the park, snapping photos, laughing and making jokes about how haunted it probably was. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, and the wind carried the creaking sounds of metal swaying. Even the smallest things, the chirping of insects, the soft rustling of leaves, felt amplified, as if the silence of the park had grown too loud. At some point, we decided to split up. It wasn't exactly planned, but we were curious to explore more, and with no cell service, it didn't matter much. The sun was nearly gone now, and the park was shrouded in deepening shadows. My group stayed near the old roller coaster, the tracks buckling in several places, making the whole structure look like it could collapse at any moment. That's when we heard it, the sound of distant laughter. It wasn't ours. It was coming from further inside the park, echoing through the hollow spaces between rides and buildings. I froze, the laughter sharp and unsettling, like it didn't belong here. "What the hell?" I whispered, glancing at my friends. They shrugged it off as more of the creepy ambiance, but something in the sound felt wrong, like it wasn't the playful kind of laughter you expect in an amusement park. It was hollow, distorted, as if coming from something that shouldn't be alive. We stood there, unsure, but before we could move, we heard it again. Closer this time. Louder. The sound seemed to be circling the park, following us without ever appearing. The chill in the air grew stronger, and the excitement that had been buzzing earlier was replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Let's head back," someone said, their voice quivering. We all agreed, eager to leave, but as we began walking, the laughter came again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was multiple voices. They echoed all around us, overlapping, as if we were surrounded. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The path we had taken seemed longer than it should have, and with each step, the laughter grew louder and more distorted. Shadows danced in the fading light, shifting unnaturally in ways that no wind or movement could create. Then came the creaking of the Ferris wheel. It was slow at first, like something winding itself into motion, but we didn't hear the sounds of it turning, only the groans of metal under unseen pressure. Suddenly, it stopped. The laughter had ceased entirely, We turned around, breath catching in our throats. Standing beneath the giant wheel, framed in the dim light, was a figure. Tall, pale, and eerily still. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but there was no mistaking the outline of its form. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us, waiting. We didn't stay long enough to figure out what it was. We ran, heart pounding, sprinting through the park as fast as we could, the echoes of our own footsteps and the distant laughter still ringing in our ears. We never looked back. It was just a normal weekend at my family's cabin by the lake. No guests, no visitors, just me, my brother, and our parents. We'd been coming here for years, so the routine was always the same. Lazy days by the water, campfires and card games, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what I thought. The first day was peaceful. We sat up by the dock, swam in the cool water, and ate dinner under the stars. By nightfall, the only sounds were the distant call of loons and the crackling fire. But as I lay in the small tent we'd pitched, something didn't feel right. The woods were always quiet at night, but that night they seemed too quiet. At first, I told myself it was just the usual overactive imagination that kicked in when you were isolated like this. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone. I sat up, straining to hear anything. The usual sounds of wildlife had vanished. The wind wasn't moving through the trees. It was too still. I finally gave up trying to sleep and unzipped the tent to step outside. The full moon lit up the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I glanced around, but there was nothing out of place. My brother's tent was still standing a few feet away, and my parents' cabin was just visible beyond the trees. The whole property was dark and peaceful, as it should have been. But as I stood there, listening to the silence, I saw something. A shadow, not quite human, not quite anything else, moving through the trees. It wasn't an animal, at least nothing I recognized. It was too tall, too thin, and moving unnaturally slow. I froze, heart pounding. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It just continued to drift deeper into the forest, blending with the darkness. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. I stared until it was gone, swallowed by the woods. When I finally returned to the tent, I told myself it had to be my imagination. There was no way something real could have been out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak of the cabin, every shifting branch outside, making my pulse spike. The next morning, my brother woke up and greeted me as usual. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked hesitantly. He frowned, scratching his head. "Now that you mention it, yeah. I thought I heard something, but I didn't want to wake you up. It was like footsteps, right?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Footsteps?" "Yeah," he said. "They weren't from us. Sounded like something walking through the woods, slow and dragging. Like someone was lost out there." We stared at each other, our shared unease growing. We checked around the cabin, searched the property, but there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone passing through. It was just us, surrounded by silence once again. That night, we kept the fire burning and stayed close. The woods felt darker, emptier. The cabin, once familiar and safe, now seemed distant and unreachable. Every sound, a branch cracking, a distant rustle, sent chills down my spine. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check again. I left the tent, walking to the edge of the trees where the shadows seemed thickest. This time, I saw it. A pale figure, even taller than before, standing just beyond the tree line. Its eyes were dark, hollow, and it tilted its head slowly as if it could feel my gaze. I held my breath, unable to look away. It took a slow step toward me, and I realized with a jolt, it wasn't walking like a person. Its legs were bent at impossible angles, as though its bones didn't move naturally. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. I watched as it drifted closer, and then, without warning, it vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My brother and I stayed close, checking each other's sanity, waiting for the dawn. When the sun rose, we packed up and left. To this day, I still wonder what we saw. I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal, maybe my imagination. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Whatever it was watching us, waiting, and I'm not sure if it ever really left. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low, as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. "Come. Closer." The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. The day started like any other. I had been hiking on a trail deep in the mountains, a place I had visited countless times before. It was my usual escape, a chance to clear my head and breathe in the crisp mountain air. But something felt different that day, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to step further in. The trail twisted through towering trees, their branches arching over the path like ancient sentinels. I had always loved this trail. Its solitude, the sense of being far from the noise of the world. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I hiked for hours, the sound of my footsteps crunching beneath the dry leaves the only company. By midday, the sunlight had started to filter through the canopy, creating long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. I paused, taking a swig of water from my bottle and looking around. The trees were older now, their trunks gnarled and thick, as though they had stood there for centuries untouched. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering, almost like the wind. But there was no wind. It came from deeper within the woods, soft and almost melodic. I strained to hear, but the whispering faded before I could make out any words. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, and now I was certain I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I found myself moving cautiously, following the sound, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in. The air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was watching. My breath came in short bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering had grown to a near silence, like something was speaking just out of reach, a voice that wanted to be heard but never could be. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but there, standing between two trees, was a figure. It wasn't tall, nor did it move like a human. Its shape was indistinct, like a mass of shadows pulled together. It seemed to be watching me, though its eyes, if it even had eyes, were dark, hollow voids. Fear tightened my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. Then the whispering returned, more distinct this time. It wasn't words, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. The figure began to shift, its shape contorting and stretching in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, I knew that much, but it wasn't entirely creature either. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispering, growing louder now, almost deafening. My head throbbed, the sound reverberating in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer. Its shadowy form had shifted again, growing darker, more defined. Panic surged through me and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell, the rough ground scraping against my palms. I looked up, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was gone. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. I didn't dare look back as I made my way out of the woods. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their branches creaking, as if they knew I had been there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I stopped. I turned to look back at the forest, but all I saw was the quiet, empty trees. The figure was gone, the whispering had vanished, but the feeling of being followed, watched, lingered. I never returned to that trail. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods, I knew I could never escape it. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the faint whispering, as if it's calling to me from the edge of the trees. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse. It was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea, it felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it or if I was the only one who ever would. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite, but no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it.